All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a discussion. This is an author-to-author discussion we're having here today, and I am so excited to be talking with the author, Shauna Lawless, whose book, The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, I just finished a couple days ago and am extremely excited to talk about. I have lots of questions for you, Shauna. And I really loved the read, by the way. It was a lot of fun to read this book. I am not an expert in Irish mythology, but I have read a fair amount, and I love Celtic mythology in general. I find it so vivid and so compelling and colorful and fascinating. So I have lots of enthusiasm for this sort of thing because it's really interesting because when I learned about Irish mythology, and I might be outdated on this, so please feel free to correct me at any point. But the way I learned it's categorized in 4 different ways. So there were the invasion myths, which involve the Fomorians and the Tuatha Danaan and all these that's the oldest stuff, really, the invasion myths. Yeah. Various peoples that came to Ireland over the centuries previous to, and then humans, of course, arrived, right? So that is one kind of set of stories. And then there was the Ulster cycle is another set of stories. And I don't know if there's another way to label that, but the one I learned was...
that would be all the Cahulan stories.
Yes,
would be the
yes, the Cahulan stories. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. He's the main character of the Ulster cycle. Yeah. And then there's the Fenian cycle, which is centered on, it's a little Arthurian-like in some ways, but it's centered on the king named Finn, right?
And Finn McCool,
yeah. And then you have these historical accounts, semi-historical, which would involve people like Brian Boru, for example, and others. That this is later than the other 2 cycles. So do I have that right? Those are the 4 categories of old Irish stories. Is that true?
Yeah, that's definitely correct. So but the first 3 interlink quite a lot.
Yes.
So members of the Tuatha Danaan who are in the first cycle appear in the Ulster cycle and interact with Cahulan. And then also would interact sometimes with Finn McCool in his cycle. And then the historical cycle isn't really a one story or one character. It's like lots of different kings, and sometimes they're quite magical and sometimes they're not. But so they're a bit more sporadic, those sort of stories, whereas the first 3 has a narrative to them.
Yeah, they're a little more cohesive, I guess. Yeah. So what you've done in The Children of Gods and Fighting Men. So we're eventually getting to this question here. Forgive me for the long-winded lead up here to the question, but I feel like what you've done, without any spoilers, but by the way, everybody, we are not doing spoilers for the first part of this conversation. We're just discuss The Children of God and Fighting Men, and maybe we'll bring up The Way of Edan, which Shauna has read. But we're going to keep it spoiler-free for now. And so, we will warn you when we do get to spoilers, though. So my question is, it seems to me that you've taken the oldest of these categories, the invasion myths, with the Fomorians and the Tuatha Danaan and all of that, and you have brought it to the newest of these categories, which would be the more historical accounts. And with some mentions of the Ulster cycle, I noticed there was at least one mention of Cahulan in there, and that sort of thing. But that's older. That's like happened already, right? The characters in the present of the story, roughly around 1000 AD or so, a little bit prior to. And I assume when you get further into the series, you're going to pass 1000 AD because some very... historically speaking, very significant events happen after 1000 AD in Ireland. But so what you've done is you combine the oldest with the most mythological, the most magical, if you will, with the most historical, although there's plenty of magic in that too. So what were you, it's interesting because why didn't you just go straight up historical fiction with this? Why did you decide to bring the magic of the oldest myth and put it into this story that is set in roughly 1000 AD or so?
Gosh, I don't know. I did try at one point just to make it historical.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't do it. It felt like I was just writing The Last Kingdom, you know, and that it really could have just been anywhere in Europe. But, and the thing is, in Ireland, lots of people, like maybe not just today, but certainly my grandmother's generation believed in kind of these old stories. It wasn't like myths that were in the past. My grandmother would have really believed in like the fairy people. So that's who the Tuatha Danaan are, kind of ancestors of the fairy people.
Yes.
Like once she left a house because she could hear them outside, and it was like she would have seen it as being bad luck.
Wow.
To be in a house where the fairy people were outside and they were paying you too much attention. So all that mythology is sort of still very much in the Irish consciousness, that in England it's not. In England, all these myths are myths. Like no one would really believe them or talk about them in the way that they do in Ireland. So for me, it felt quite natural to kind of fuse together Irish mythology and Irish history. And of course, the Ulster cycle, which you spoke about, which is the Cuchulainn stories.
Yeah.
So Cuchulainn is the son of a man called Louis.
Yes.
And he is of the Tuatha Danaan.
Yep.
So I kind of would read those stories. And of course, Cuchulainn was a very famous warrior. And I had it in my head, well, he's obviously got these powers from his father. And Finn McCool is the same. His grandfather was of the Tuatha Danaan. And so it just put into my head, well, what if there was more of these descendants who were kind of from the Tuatha Danaan and they were still living in Ireland, and what happened to them? You know, in Irish folklore, which comes after mythology, it came about as a way of explaining why people still believed in the magic of Ireland, but because of Christianity, weren't actually allowed to believe in the old, like, pagan gods.
Right.
And so the Tuatha Danaan in the mythology are banished underground. And so this is when the fairy people kind of came about, when they were evil and you shouldn't trust them. And that was a way of the church sort of saying, well, you can believe they used to be here, but now they're bad. And that's where a lot of the folklore stories came from. And like leprechauns would play tricks on you, and the fairy people would steal your children. And so they became quite malevolent, but the Tuatha Danaan, who they are based on, actually saved the people of Ireland from slavery, which is in the first cycle that you spoke about. So for me, it was sort of trying to tell a story about ancient Ireland, but reclaiming those myths and making the Tuatha Danaan good again, or at least not malevolent in the way that the folklore stories had described them as being. So this is very long-winded.
Oh, it's wonderful. I love it. I love it. Yeah. No, it's fascinating to me because I feel like people who cling to their myths, and this is very generalizing of me, but I like this theory, I guess. People who cling to their myths are often there's a lot of wonderful storytellers among such people. I look at Iceland, which is a place where a lot of Irish people ended up, by the way, as you well know. But Iceland is another place where they actually preserved their mythology. And whereas in England, when they became Christian, they really just dumped it for the most part. There are a few very, in the landscape, there are a few references to Woden and that sort, and of course in the days of the week, Wednesday and all of that, and Thor's Day being on Thursday and all that. But it's really, for the most part, and there have been people like Tolkien, for example, who lamented the fact that most mythology of whatever the Anglo-Saxons had was discarded when they became Christian. I mean, there's very little left. We have Beowulf, really, as and there are certain references to elves and creatures and that sort of thing in Beowulf. So we have a little bit in Beowulf, but it's nothing compared to what we have in the sagas of Iceland, where they were Christianized in about 1000 or so. And it's a fascinating aspect of your book too, to me, because that is a period of some change in terms of religion happening. You still have some people clinging to all the old religion of Ireland, the native religion. You have the Viking presence in Ireland when they're mostly pagan, and you have the new religion on the block, so to speak, which is of course Christianity, which had been around for a few centuries by 1000 in Ireland, but still, it's fascinating to me, and so I think it's maybe an interesting comparison between Ireland and Iceland, because they both, for whatever reason, they seem more tolerant of the old stories, and they kept telling them for a long time, and they were preserved in those cultures. And I feel like these are both wonderful cultures for stories. So I don't know. It's just my theory. Would you buy that or not?
Well, I think there's lots of reasons. I think because the Romans did not invade Ireland, and also they didn't invade Iceland either, which they have in common. No. So I think the transition to Christianity in Ireland happened a bit differently.
Yes.
In that it was later, it was less forceful. And so while the Irish converted, and they did convert, and they called themselves Christians, and they went to church. The Irish legal system was still the pagan system.
Yes.
Whereas in England, it converted to Christian law quite quickly. And so you had the law aligned with the religion, and in Ireland it never matched up. And so you would have, certainly in Ireland, you would have had divorce was legally fine, happened all the time at this period of history. I suppose the church itself was full of the king's relatives, so the church didn't hold so much power in Ireland as it would have had in other countries, where the church at times would have challenged the monarchy. That certainly did not happen in Ireland. And so the old ways stayed in place, and they weren't challenged. And so it was sort of, we'll be Christians, and the conversion went quite easily, but actually they weren't really truly converted, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, it's like, here's this shrine to this old goddess, and well, you can make her a saint, and that's okay, which is where you know, Bridget or whatever,
So she's the most famous example. So Bridget of the Tuatha Danaan was like one of the main goddesses, and Saint Bridget, they decided to have her saint day on the same day as the original Bridget of the Tuatha Danaan's day. So it's just like they've merged the two things together, and so everyone is out celebrating Bridget, and maybe it doesn't matter so much which one. So it was quite, I think it was maybe about 150 years after my book when the Normans invaded Ireland. One of the reasons that they, as their basis for invasion, was that Ireland hadn't converted properly, and that they were coming over to reconvert Ireland.
Well, you had Celtic Christianity, which grew up kind of isolated from how the Roman Catholic Church developed. And it was interesting because there was a period in England where it was the Irish who were converting the English from the north of England. And then you had Pope Gregory sending Augustine to the south, to Kent. And so they were being Christianized from two different directions. And in the north, there was Celtic Christianity was actually the primary influence for a while. Eventually, the two, because they had different dates for Easter, and they had slightly, different things going on. And so eventually they did hold a council at which it was decided to ditch the Celtic form and go wholesale Roman Catholic. And so for political reasons too, right? Because
of course,
so it's interesting, a very interesting period, and I don't think a ton of people are aware that there was a Celtic form of Christianity that developed for centuries, that really was independent of Rome for quite some time. So that's kind of neat. And something that I'd love to learn more about. I don't know how much knowledge there is about that foreign Christianity. I know there's scholars who've written about it and that sort of thing, but it seems that it was a more perhaps tolerant form of Christianity in terms of how they dealt with the older stories, that they allowed them to exist, and incorporated them into the current faith in some ways. So I find that very interesting. And you have characters in your book who have various feelings about this faith or that faith, and it's an interesting theme, I think, that you've incorporated into your story as well, the transition in terms of the religious beliefs and that sort of thing. So very cool. All right. Well, I've harassed you for a bit there with my questions. Did you want to ask me anything about, because I do have historical influences in my book as well.
Yes, I did notice them. I actually obviously, well, I don't want to go into spoilers, but I actually felt that I could see lots of Celtic mythology in your book.
Yes.
That came through very strongly for me, which I really enjoyed. But obviously your book is fantasy with mythological inspiration. And so maybe I'll ask that question to you. Why did you decide to go like straightforward, epic, heroic fantasy?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And so I would say the two of us are very similar in our influences. We like old stuff. We like old stories, and we've incorporated them into our own storytelling with our own twists. But I created an entirely fictional world, whereas you have this lovely map in the beginning of your book, and that is indeed Ireland there. So your setting is, of course, you put your own touches on this and everything else. You've taken liberties, or you've interpreted the historical record in a way that fits with your storytelling. Because there are certain, I think, disparities in some of the accounts, like a certain character might have been married to this person or maybe not, and you've gone in a certain direction with that. And so
there was 2 different potential wedding dates offered for one of my characters in the historical record. So if there's 2 dates offered, I will just go for one that suits me and be quite happy that it's still historically accurate. But I suppose a blessing and a curse for me was that this time in Ireland wasn't heavily documented. And so it's a curse sometimes because you're really digging for information. And there's not a lot of it. But then I suppose that the blessing can be then you're not too constrained by sticking to a period of history that is overly documented. Like, for the example, the Tudor period would be kind of maybe very difficult to write about because there's so much documentation about that period of history. You know, any slight deviation would be picked up by somebody, whereas in Ireland it's just not the case. There's not a lot of documentation.
And there you've really hit on the reason why I went more for a fantasy world. I made up fictional world with obvious inspirations from our world. Among them are definitely Celtic. I learned Welsh when I was younger, so that doesn't help me at all to pronounce Irish things, unfortunately. Irish is, although they're both Celtic languages, Irish is it's a Q Celtic or Goidelic versus the Welsh, which is the P Celtic or Brythonic language. So, and really knowing Welsh doesn't help me at all with Irish.
Completely
different. By the way, do you speak Irish at all?
Like a very little bit, maybe like more conversational. I was going to classes to improve my Irish, but I had to put them on pause for the last few months. But I do want to go back because it's like important in the way even that we speak. Have you ever read stories that have Irish people in them? And sometimes when people are not from Ireland, I find they make Irish people sound like slightly drunk Yoda / pirate style because
I'm sorry for laughing at that, but yes.
It's true, right? But the reason why that is done is because Irish it's just a very different language to English. So,
Yeah.
and most people in Ireland only really started to speak English about 1850, so after the Irish famine.
Yeah.
And so the English that is spoken in Ireland, the translations aren't, that have been done directly, and that's why sometimes it sounds like we speak backwards. You know, so and you can't directly translate some things. So if you were to say in English, like, and you're from England, I am sad, you would say I am sad.
Yeah.
But in Irish, you would say a sadness is upon me.
Oh, I love
so the
that.
emotion is on you.
Yeah.
So it's just that's why the dialect is just so, it's slightly different.
Interesting.
And so for me, see, understanding that is very useful then to write dialogue for different characters, to kind of try and imbue that they are Irish without exaggeration.
Yeah.
And to show those speech patterns. And like, a lot of my sentences will start with the word but, when people speak, but why did you go there? But who is he? And if you ever come to Ireland, you'll hear people go uck all the time. Like, uck, don't tell me he went there, or uck, you know, I didn't do that. But the word uck is but. It's the Irish for but.
Yeah.
And so it's all those little things that I think are really important to kind of show how a dialect would work, if that sort of makes sense, and to make it sound authentic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that sounds very, maybe there's a Celtic influence in that construction you mentioned there. Like in Welsh is similar, because in Welsh, you don't say I'm thirsty, you say my sychadar nai, which means there is a thirst upon me, right? Which is very
exactly the same in Irish.
My sychadar nai means I'm thirsty, but it really literally means there's a thirst upon me, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's,
and that's really cool, because emotions and feelings are fleeting.
Yeah.
And so it's upon you, but then it will leave you.
Yeah.
Whereas I suppose in English, I am sad, you know, is that permanent, or is that just at the moment? And so I love those differences in languages. They're fascinating.
Oh, I love them too. I think it's fantastic. And one of my favorite translation of Beowulf, though I prefer to read it in Old English, but my favorite translation of Beowulf is by Seamus Heaney, who has a lot of Irishisms in that translation, particularly because he's from Northern Ireland, I believe. So there are some of the dialect words in there that are very particular to Northern Ireland. But it gives that translation, I think, a lot of its poeticness. It's just it's a wonderful translation. Maybe I talked about it with my friend AP Canavan, who is from Northern Ireland, and a lot of those little Northern Irish words in there are, to us, they make the poem sound, you know, compelling and interesting. But for AP, he reads these words and he's like, that's weird to have that in there, because he knows that word, right? He's familiar with that word. It's a living word.
Yes. Northern Ireland has its own little language going on, because you've got the Scots influence, and then Irish, and then Anglicized Irish, and it's strange, I think, for when people come over sometimes to understand what we're saying.
Oh, it's such a rich, wonderful thing. And so language, I love hearing this, because what you're telling me is language is important for your storytelling. And there's a consciousness of a particularly Irish, though you're writing in English, this is a very Irish form of English that you're writing in.
Exactly.
That's important for the storytelling, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think, see, obviously, because Ireland was a country that was conquered, and certainly if I go back to my grandmother's generation and the generation before her, like, a lot of people wouldn't have had a very good education. But stories were kept and told by traveling shonachis. So storytellers would have gone around, and so that art of storytelling and, you know, being very poetic, even if you're not well educated, is something that is important in the culture. And so telling a story and telling it well is a good thing in Ireland. You know, it rains here a lot. You need to have people to entertain you. So
Oh, it's wonderful. I find it so fascinating and beautiful. So I think you've captured that spirit really beautifully in your writing. So
Oh,
congratulations
thank
on
you.
that. Yeah. Yeah. But in terms of, yeah, that decision, do I write historical fiction? Do I write fantasy? If I do fantasy, do I set it in our world or do I just make up a world? So like you said, there are pros and cons, right? So if you
Yeah,
decide I'm going to write my story in historical Ireland, then you have to be careful because there's somebody out there who's going to say, well, actually, this little fact here is this is how this happened, right? So you feel like you're going to be like called out for any inaccuracy. On the other hand, if you do what I did, which was to make up a world with very purposeful nods toward various cultures, because I'm trying to portray relationships between the cultures in my world that are similar in some ways, because I have a culture that is more Anglo-Saxon based and that has a
yeah,
relationship with another culture, which is definitely more Celtic based. And it's in some ways there are echoes of the relationship between England and the Celtic parts of the world. Um, and you talked about that history of conquest and oppression and that sort of thing. So there's definitely something that I'm trying to borrow as well in my storytelling by having this inspiration come from here, this from here, and that for people who know our history well enough, those names should conjure, I hope, that kind of feeling that, okay, this is a relationship between a more aggressive culture that is invading this other culture. So I'm cheating a little bit, I guess, in a way by taking these influences. But the hard part then is, of course, if you're doing it the way I've chosen to do it, you have to make up a world, which is fun, but it's also a lot of work. I had to make up a
yeah.
map and I have to make up a history and a mythology and all of this stuff. So that's the downside, as you could say, I guess, is you really have to. I think for you, if anybody has any knowledge whatsoever of just how beautiful the west coast of Ireland is, you don't have to do a ton of description.
Yeah.
You can conjure that pretty easily. Whereas I'm making up this place entirely from scratch, so I feel like I have to describe the landscape a bit. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
That's so true. I remember once I was talking to someone about writing, and I was fantasy and they wrote romance. And she was saying, you have to describe your world so well, because I can just go, I looked out my window and saw the Eiffel Tower.
Uh-huh.
And immediately you're in Paris. I literally don't need to describe anything. You in your mind already know where you are
Just say
because the
Eiffel
Eiffel
Tower.
Tower is
Yeah,
there.
that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
It's
So
hard for you.
whenever you're writing fantasy,
Yeah.
you have to make it very believable, and people like to have a very clear idea of what they're looking at and how it's different, and how different kingdoms within your world are different to each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sure a lot of work has to go into that, which you did do very well. I really enjoyed your story.
Oh, good.
I really enjoyed the different cultures, and I did tell you that I opened up the book and the first character I came across was someone called Finnan, which is my son's name.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
So
Yeah.
I was heavily invested in Finnan, and
Oops.
don't
Well,
want to give any
we'll talk
spoilers.
about Finnan
Yeah,
later.
yeah, poor Finnan.
Poor Finnan. Yeah.
I
Uh,
know. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. No, I did that on purpose. So I guess we could do spoilers now, unless you had any other non-spoiler points that you wanted to talk about. Was there anything
Oh,
else?
well, I definitely wanted to ask you about your inspiration for the religion of the Way of Edan.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But that maybe is spoilerish, because I find that very intriguing in your world, and because it's not really just religion, it is also magical.
Yeah.
And so kind of and then obviously there's the other side of it,
Yes. Yeah.
which Day Raven is a part of. So it was where that came from was
Yeah.
my big question for you.
Yeah. So like you, I'm very interested in periods of transition when it comes to religion and how older faiths can coexist alongside newer faiths. So I have 4 different religions in this world that I've made up. And one of them is the Way of Edan, which is the newest of the 4. And there was a prophet a few hundred years before the story takes place who started this religion, the prophet Aldmund. And so he had basically a vision of a sort. He had an experience, let's say, that convinced him that he wanted to start a faith that was centered around a more monotheistic understanding of God, as opposed to the older faith that his culture, which is very Germanic, very Old English based, they had a pantheon of gods before. And that religion still exists in more rural parts of this world. But the most powerful kingdom, Torland, has almost completely converted to the Way of Edan by the time the story happens. Whereas the older faith, the belief in the old gods still exists in the smaller kingdoms that border Torland, such as the Mark, and not so much in Elend, but you'll find it still there as well. Because it hasn't been as rigidly enforced as it has in Torland, where they really wanted to eradicate the old beliefs and replace them entirely. So it's almost, the old gods are almost entirely extinct in Torland, whereas the kingdoms, the Mark and Elend, still have a significant number of people who follow the older religion, particularly in the Mark. Actually, still probably a majority there who follow the old gods. So those 2 are there. And then there's another, so this continent, the original inhabitants of this continent were the Dwergs, which, they're dwarves. They're essentially dwarves. Dwarf is from the Old Norse word, whereas dwerg is from the Old English word, and they're the same thing.
Right.
So I chose to use the Old English word, which you will see sometimes in Tolkien, where he doesn't use the word dwerg, but dwero, like the Dwero Delph, and he'll use it occasionally. But it's essentially they're dwarves, and they have a religion of sorts. It's ancestor worship. So they don't have gods, but they have ancestor worship, and they're the native people of this continent. They were there long before, thousands and thousands of years before anyone else. And then I've talked about the more northern people who are more like basically inspired by Old English and Old Norse and Old Germanic cultures. And then there's another people who were there before these Germanic peoples, and these are what I call the Andumai, and the Andumaic peoples. And they originally came from a faraway place as well, almost a couple thousand years before the present of the story. And they brought with them a dualistic religion. So they have the mother and the father, and those are their 2 gods. And so they have this dualism to their faith. And the more Celtic parts of this continent are where the Germanic people and the Andumai type people have blended the most. So what I did was I took a Germanic culture and the Andumai, which I used to live in South Asia. So I based a lot of the Andumaic culture on my experience living in South Asia. Not completely, it's not meant to be, South Asia or anything like that, but there are aspects of it that are very South Asian. So where these 2 cultures met and blended is where I chose to make a more Celtic. So the 2 kingdoms really of Danaan and Caergillion are that. They're a mix of these other 2 cultures. So the Dwergs have really been sidelined. They live up in remote areas, but these other 2 cultures, though they're actually not aware of their history. They're not terribly aware. They tend to think of themselves as much more pure, as many people do in the world. Like, we're this, they have this narrative about their identity, and they don't have a really strong sense of the history behind. So if you look at many historical countries, what does it mean to be English, for example? Well, there've been waves and waves of different, peoples who've come and are part of there was a Celtic population there. The Romans came there. Then you had the Anglo-Saxons, and you had the Vikings, and then you had the Normans, who were Frenchified Vikings, and then of course you've had much later immigrant populations coming. So people are much more mixed, I think, than we often think. So
Oh, that is an absolute certainty, because I know when I was writing The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, there was Ireland went through a huge period where Vikings ravaged Ireland and took a lot of Irish people
Yep.
north. But by the time I'm writing my book, the Vikings have settled in Ireland and have married into the Irish royal families. And actually Dublin is now a kind of a trading city where lots of slaves from other countries are coming into and being bought now by the Irish.
And you put that in there. You actually have that in the book too. You have some Mediterranean people and that sort of thing present in Ireland. Yeah.
Yes. And for me, it's very, very important, because I think sometimes, when we talk about immigration, people kind of talk about it as something that's just happening now, like it's a modern phenomenon that happened maybe when airplanes arrived, but it isn't. People have moved for thousands of years, and so I could not write about Ireland at a time when there's like a slave market there and just not have any people from other countries. It just would have made no sense. It would have been historically inaccurate. So so for me it was very important to show, you have Ireland, which is sort of continuing as it has always been, but these Viking ports are just completely different. There's a completely different culture there. There's lots of people there, but also but because they are beginning to merge and marry into each other, there is like a fusion is beginning to happen. And so people from the cities are moving into the country, and I have to talk about that. It's interesting, but important to show that, yes, cultures are always merging and moving and mixing, and it's not something that's just happened in the last 50 years.
So true, especially if you look at the Vikings. I mean, they were all the way over in the Eastern Roman Empire. They were in the Middle East, all the way over to
Egypt,
some of them came all the way to here, right near where I live in what's now the United States and Canada. So they were all over the place, and they interacted with peoples in all these places. And so some of those people came. So we have accounts of an Arab chap who made it his way up north to Viking settlements and that sort of thing. And we have all kinds of intermingling and meeting other cultures and all sorts of things. So yeah, I'm totally with you there. And I love that you reflected that in your book. I think you're absolutely right. And that's where the currently our historical understanding lies, is that actually these times were much more diverse than we've acknowledged previously. That there was a lot more.
I think so.
Yeah.
I do think so. And I think I've said this before, but I think Hollywood and that kind of TV movie era, where you had the kind of politics of America at the time, where movie land was just very white, and so all the movies that were historical fictions set in Egypt and Rome and Greece, everyone's white. Even like London in the 17th, 18th century, everyone's white, and that's completely inaccurate. That's not
very
true.
inaccurate.
So if you're watching a BBC Great Expectations adaptation from the 1980s, everyone is white, and in the Dickens and time, that would not have been the case.
That's not true at all.
And so I think people kind of look at those shows, and it's just ingrained in you that you think that that's the way England used to look. And now it's like, it's very different, but it's just not true. It's always been very diverse. And I think Elizabeth I, whenever she was trying to pander to Philip of Spain, and he was having his very strict kind of Catholic conversion, I can't remember what it's called. But he was really very strict, and he had I think he had signed orders for the Muslims in Spain to leave. And Elizabeth wrote something similar in England, and it's a significant number of people in London that had to go. And so you're like, so in Elizabethan time, in like 1580, when she's signing this decree, a significant number of people are being asked to leave England. And you're like, so that's really long ago, you know. So I think Europe, and then you go back to the Roman times and the Roman Empire, and they're slaves from Africa and from all over, and that's all mixed into England and into Europe.
Yeah.
And so, no, I think really, if you're doing a historical research project, it's really important that you think, actually, what did people look like? Was there cultures that were mixing? And the answer for me, like, is yes, unless you're going really, really, really far back.
Yeah, that's right.
People are always moving and trading and looking for new opportunities.
Yes, yeah, that's what the Vikings were all about, you know. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that's fascinating to me. Before we get into the spoilers, though, I do want to give you a chance to, are there any other important influences that you would cite in terms of your storytelling, other than the obvious sort of the Irish ancient stories and all of that? In other words, are you a fan of like 19th century novels or anything like that, where you would consider some influences in there or anything like that? Anything that would surprise us, perhaps?
Well, I think Game of Thrones is probably a more obvious influence.
Cersei's presence is definitely there. Yeah. I feel very beautifully in there. Yeah.
So I kind of liked having the two female main characters and making them quite grey. I think there's been a period in literature where, because a lot of historical fiction stories are told with male protagonists.
Yes.
Then there was a sort of a counter to that, where you would have female protagonists, but they were always good. So kind of pedestaled a little bit. And I was like, no, I don't want that. I want kind of the women in this, you know, they're living in a very harsh environment. I think if you have any sort of desire to hold any power for yourself, you need to be a bit ruthless and ambitious.
Yes.
And I wanted to showcase those qualities.
Yeah, and there are good reasons too. Like this particular character we're talking about, we're going to give her name in a bit, but she's mentioned in some of the Icelandic sagas too, and Njal's saga particularly, and characterized much the way you portrayed her, I think, right?
Oh yes, so she's not portrayed as a very nice person, but for her even to be written in a saga like that, shows that she was a character, like she was worth mentioning. And so at the start I was like, should I sort of change that? Should I make her more sympathetic? And then I just went, no, I'm actually going to make her worse. I'm going to make her kind of actually, you know, be even worse than they described her. And unashamedly so, which has been a lot of fun. So there's definitely Game of Thrones there. I've also quite liked Philippa Gregory did a series called The White Queen.
Okay.
Have you ever?
I have not read those.
Well, but there's 3 books in the series, and they're from 3 different women during the time of the War of the Roses.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Okay.
Yeah, and so I found that series very interesting. That kind of these 3 women were behind the scenes trying to really help either their husbands or their sons become King of England. And so there's actually a little bit of mythology in those stories as well. I think French mythology is included in it. So that was also quite interesting, and it kind of gave me a bit of courage to go into this story as a historical fantasy, knowing that that's kind of what Philippa Gregory had done, even though it was marketed as historical fiction. But she had put magical powers into some of the women characters in her stories.
Cool.
What else? Probably the only other thing, and I wouldn't like really just compare myself to this writer, but The Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite stories ever.
Okay.
And I do quite like how the Count's political scheming for revenge is quite intricate and slow, and all the threads are being woven, and you're kind of following how that's happening. I always enjoyed that aspect of that story.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, those are wonderful. So so I think we're ready for spoilers now. So let's give everybody the wave. We're doing spoilers, everybody. So if you have not read children of gods and fighting men, or we might give spoilers from the Way of Edan as well. So if you haven't read those two books, you might want to go. If you're spoiler tolerant, then feel free to stick around. But we are going to just freely discuss these two books wherever we want to go. But I'd like to start. Here's the first spoiler thing. I have to start by apologizing for killing Finan.
I know, I was devastated.
Right from the get-go, and I didn't know your son was at the time that I named this character. Of course, I didn't know you, and I didn't know your son was named that. But I did have a reason, and I wanted to tell you this. I did have a reason for giving him a Celtic name, because he comes from Torland, along with these two other priests, and these other two priests have very clearly Anglo-Saxon names, Germanic sounding names. Why did I make Finan give him an Irish name? Well, as I said earlier, I wanted to make those two kingdoms, Cargillion and Danaan, kind of give them a Celtic aura. And the fact of the matter is, when the people who invaded these more Germanic-inspired people who would eventually found the kingdom of Torland, when they invaded that area, there was a kingdom there before. I talk about it in the book. It was called Riodara. And these were the same people who were basically, they were pushed by these more Germanic type people. They were pushed south into what's now Danaan and Cargillion. And in the minds of the people of Torland, they just pushed all these people out and they were gone, right? But what really happened in my head, in the history that I have, my secret history of this world, is that in reality, there was a lot of mixing over the generations. Which makes a lot more sense, because a lot of people would have stayed.
People don't just disappear.
Exactly. And they would have mixed into, particularly in the southern part of this kingdom, which borders with Danaan, there would have been a lot of mixing and even taking on of names and such. So without even knowing it, Finan has what would be to him, a foreign name, but he doesn't think of it that way. He's ignorant of the fact that part of his heritage, probably his genetic makeup, is and he even thinks of these people as strange and foreign. He's there to try to do his little part. And basically, he's there to instigate an incident that will be an excuse for a war. But he does it really he thinks it's an act of love, because they need to be converted to this.
He's really devout.
It's about their salvation, right? So he's very devout and he believes in this mission. He's doing it from what he believes is a place of love, along with these two other priests who are going to be martyred. They're going there to martyr themselves. And so they deliberately insult the goddess of the temple of the local people in Yarfine, which is the chief city of Cargillion. And he gets himself killed on purpose, right? But there's this little irony in the back of my head that actually, Finan, you've got some of them in you. And he even mentions the story that, if the tales were true, some of these people have Torlander blood in them, right? And so he looks at them and they're darker skinned than he is, and he's like, I don't really know how that could be, but the truth is, we have these categories, these rigid categories that don't really hold up in reality. So that's kind of what I was playing around a little bit with. That's why I wanted him to have a Celtic name, as opposed to an Anglo-Saxon one. So
no, that totally makes sense. And I remember that scene very vividly, because he's looking out at the crowd and they feel different to him, but they're not actually. If you went back a few generations, they would probably, they're still mixing, which is very interesting. And obviously interesting also that those three characters are so devout and they really believe in what they're doing, but they have obviously been manipulated by people above them to do this for a political reason, not a religious reason.
Yes, although they would see it as religious, but I think you're right in characterizing it as political. Yeah. And you asked earlier what I was basing this on, and it's a fictional religion, of course. The Way of Edan is a fictional religion, but I think it's not too much of a stretch to see some parallels to medieval Christianity in there. It's a monotheistic faith that displaced older polytheistic faiths. there are significant differences too, of course. But the idea of really what I was trying to portray, and I hope it came across too, that really there's quite a diversity of people within this faith, that some of them are gentle and peaceful and loving genuinely. And then others are more aggressive because they believe the most important thing for them to do is to spread this religion because it will.
Yes, at any cost. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that we've seen historically. You know, we had the Crusades, we had the Inquisition, we've had a lot of violence perpetrated in the name of religion. And you know, you had I'm from New England. You had the Salem witch trials, right? The Puritans were burning people alive, you know, in the name of religion. So lots of things have been done. Very aggressive, terrible things have been done in the name of religion. So that's something I'm trying to explore in there.
Yeah, I did find that very interesting. And I think I listened to Mike's book's review of your book, and he said he kind of compared it a little bit to Pillars of the Earth.
Yeah, by Ken Follett. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, I did see that too. Is it Bledla?
Bledla. I always pronounce it Bledla, but yeah.
Bledla. I saw that with him as that character, as sort of anything justifies the spreading of the religion, but there's so much ego packed in there as well. It's also kind of he wants to rule everything. It's also the spreading of himself, as you know, it's the same thing to him as a religion. So I enjoyed that character a lot. Because he's not evil, but he's doing lots of really bad things, but he thinks most of it's really justified.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anything to bring about the kingdom of the eternal, right? Which is for him, that's the salvation of humanity at stake right there. So he cannot compromise. And he is consistent in his morality. He's not a hypocrite. You can't call him a hypocrite. He does to his own body. He subdues his own flesh in the same way that he seeks to subdue other people, right? So he's morally consistent. Now, I don't particularly agree with his morality in many ways, but you can't call him a hypocrite. And unlike some of his compatriots in the Way of Edan, some of them are much more like Yorman, for example, is pretending to believe in something that he doesn't really believe in order to and there are moments when I feel like he has some valid points too, right? And his criticisms, he's critical of this blind faith that is producing so much violence in the world. And then there's Arna, who's also, you know, having a crisis of faith because he doesn't believe that violence is the way to spread this religion, right? So he'd rather do it through peaceful means. But yeah, I'm trying to get some complexity in there as well.
But I think that's good because I think like nowadays fantasy fans want that complexity. You don't like want just like the bad guys versus the good guys. Like even within the antagonists, there's complexity there too.
Yeah,
there are people that you know you really dislike, and there's some people you kind of do like, and you understand them. And there's definitely conflict within those the priests that you mentioned, those three, which I'm expecting we're going to see more of that in book 2.
Yeah, I mean that's so well said. And when I think of your book and I think of your 2 POV characters, both have conflict and just beautifully woven into their stories. If we could talk about Gormla first, though, because she's the one that is such a wonderful riff in some ways. I think you must have had Cersei in mind in some ways when you were writing this character. Just beautiful, or not? Maybe, I don't know, unconsciously, perhaps. I don't know.
Maybe unconsciously. So I do like Cersei, but Cersei isn't. Well, and Tyrion says this as well. She's not half as clever as she thinks she is.
Oh, yeah.
She's she's got her father to back her up always.
Yeah.
Tyrion backs her up, and she doesn't even appreciate that he helps her. Obviously, she's had her brother.
Yeah.
And then her husband, Robert. And actually, well, I suppose I'll not worry too much about spoiling Game of Thrones because I think everyone's read it by now. But so once they all leave her,
Yeah.
Once they all leave her, she actually does a terrible job at
Yeah.
holding her power.
Her,
And so
yeah, the more extreme parts of her personality take over, I guess, without any
yeah,
of those checks and balances. Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So she's clever, but she in those previous books, those other people have held her back
Yeah.
where it's needed, and that has always sort of kept her right. But on her own, she's not as good as she thinks she is, right?
Yeah. But
So she
Cersei
ends up
also
getting.
she has a point here and there though, doesn't she? So
Oh
one,
yeah, like yeah,
like she says, I think one of the things that she's very right about is, hey, why am I not in line? Because I'm a woman, and
yeah,
that's stupid, right?
yeah,
And the other thing about her that I think most people could at least say is a good quality, she's very protective of her children, which of course is something you could say of Gormla as well. I mean, there's no
yeah,
doubt about it that she loves her son, no doubt about it, and is very sacrificing in relation to him. So, which is
yeah,
really cool because you want to hate this woman, right? But
yeah,
she's right though about a couple things. Like, if okay, you're treating me like this because I'm a woman and you're stupid, and yeah, I'm like, yes, she's right, And then the other thing is, wow, she really cares about this son of hers, and you would call that dedication in another person, right? So
yeah. I think, and so this is obviously Cersei's point and Gormla's point, is that if they were men, they would be lauded probably as being very successful people,
yep,
as
that's right.
having wonderful qualities in a king. So, but when they're women, it's like they don't appreciate these qualities. So Gormla is very clever. She can see the bigger picture, so she knows kind of the political schemes that are going on that everyone else is quite slow to pick up on.
Yeah.
She's loyal to Citric. He's the only person who's ever loved her, and so that is very much an important thing to her. She never felt loved by her parents or her first husbands, whereas Citric was hers, and so she wants to help him be king, and that's sort of her drive in the story. But yeah, but she's complex because she wants things to be better for herself, but doesn't really care about them being better for anyone else.
Yeah.
So she's
Yeah.
not really worried about the treatment of women as such. She's worried about the treatment of herself. And so she has great points to make, but she's selfish in how she applies them. Is her flaw, I suppose.
That's very true. Of course, I also tend to think, how else would you view the world when you were given away as a 13-year-old to a disgusting old man, I mean, it's kind of like,
right, yeah.
She hasn't been taught that genuine loving relationships are a thing, right? She's been used brutally prior to us meeting her in this story. And we get a lot of her reflections on that. So we know that was a traumatic thing for her to be married off as a 13-year-old to a 70-year-old, brutal Viking guy,
Yeah.
And that's another thing I think is true of Cersei as well. Married off for political, a noble woman in those in medieval inspired worlds is often married for, or almost always married for, political reasons. And there's no consideration of her personal feelings or love or anything, doesn't enter it, right?
Yeah. In this time in Ireland, once the Vikings landed in those port regions, it was almost a race, I think, to marry your daughters or sisters into those families because so much wealth was created. So before Amlaf was married to Gormla, he was married to Fictional, who's the High King of Ireland's his mother. So his mother is widowed and then gets married off to this Viking king as well. So she was almost like a high queen. And then her husband died. And then it's like, well, we need to get these Vikings on our side. You're going to have to marry into this family. So, and that's all the records in Ireland is intermarrying of the royal families. And these people are very unlikely ever to have met.
Yeah.
marriages are all really political alliances.
Yeah.
Which is very unfair, really. And yes, that's something that Gormla has hated. She hated that aspect of her life and is determined that that's not going to happen to her again. And she is going to create a path for herself that's independent of anyone else. And I think she probably believes that if Citric, her son, becomes king in a way that will save her, that he will look after her.
Yeah, that's
but of course
sad.
he doesn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, Olaf tells her, hey, your son's going to betray you. And, Olaf, great inclusion of him, by the way. I thought that was fantastic. He gives her a perspective that I think it creates some fear in her, oh, my son, is he going to really do this to me? And of course he does. But the historical Gormla, actually, not your character, but the historical one, there is a version of events, at least, I believe, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you probably did a lot of research on this, and you chose to go one way with this. The historical Gormla was actually married in some of the accounts to the character you've named Amlaf, who was called Olaf. But I understand why you didn't name him Olaf too. Yeah, you avoided two Olafs, which was smart.
Yeah.
But then was married, according to some accounts, to Secniel, right?
Yeah.
The High King.
I couldn't find any proper documentation of that other than it's recorded in a poem that she had 3 husbands, but it wasn't recorded anywhere else. It's just a poem. Yeah. And it's very vague, even that poem. It doesn't mention Secniel's name, I don't think. And she had no children by him, and he's still alive at this time. So for me, I went with
you give a nod to it though by you do give a nod to it by having him kind of be icky and attracted to her, I think. Right?
Yeah. So there's a nod to that they might have been married but not. So she, in my story, she's married to the two people who is properly documented, and it's documented in many places that she was married to both Amlav/Olaf and King Brian. They're 2 people that was 100% Secniel. There isn't much evidence for that relationship.
Okay. Yeah. And I think the way you've done it is perfect in your story. So yeah. And I admire her independent spirit. And, would she have been as horrible a person if she had been able to live in a non-patriarchal society? I think
I don't think so. She's been shaped by her experiences, definitely.
Right.
She was sort of like a lamb thrown to the wolves a little bit, and has sort of turned into a wolf a bit herself to try and survive. Yep.
So, there's part of me that kind of sympathizes with her at times. So that's really well done. I mean, when you can do that, when you can have a character who's at times horrible and other times I'm sympathizing with her, that's really well done. I love that.
Yeah.
And then your other POV is actually my favorite character in the book. And I like her. I love her a lot. I think she's beautiful and pleasant, but she has her own conflicts as well. We're talking about Fola, of course. And you've made her into one of the Tuatha Danaan, which I love. And her gift is healing, which puts her in some difficult situations because, and I love the fact that you didn't make the Tuatha Danaan the good guys. Some of them are jerks. Some of them are not. Some of them are unpleasant and manipulative, and they certainly see themselves, I think, as the good guys, and the Fomorians as the Fomorians more in the past, I guess. So now the relationship with humanity is probably what they're mostly concerned about, but there's some complexity among them as well, isn't there?
Yes, and that was important as well, just to have that complexity there, and to make Fola again like another character that I think everyone knows of Fola, in that she's very sweet, very, very caring and kind, absolutely lacks confidence in herself, and has been manipulated a lot. and so then has been put into a situation where suddenly she has to think for herself, and she's a fish out of water, a little bit. And it's her, I suppose, inherent goodness that ultimately sees her through. Her kindness, like people end up loving her, even though she's made to look very unattractive by other members of the Tuatha Danaan, because they didn't want her to be attractive to the mortal men. But even people see through that. People see all the goodness that's in her, and so she's a very sweet character, but not perfect. Not perfect. Like, there's things that she has done in her life that she regrets. She finds it hard sometimes to be brave, and to challenge her belief system that she knows is wrong, but finds it hard to sort of push through and act on it. So that was very interesting as well.
I think the real crisis point in her narrative for me, and the moment where that's going to haunt her, I am sure, is when she kind of freezes, but chooses not to heal Lonan, who is just a lovable, wonderful character. And of course, she earlier had saved his wife and child, and in a way that was a bit of, going against the rules, right? It turned out well because he happened to be connected to Murka, and it did give her the in eventually that she needed to get into King Brian's circle. But she did it not knowing all that and thinking, oops, I'm not supposed to do this. I'm only told to do this once, and I'm going to waste it by saving this woman and her child. It turned out fine. So she had a really important connection with his family, and for her to knowing that pesky red bird is watching her, and knowing that Tomas is basically hovering over her in the form of this messenger, she lets Lonan die. She allows him to die.
She can't find that in that moment. That bravery is just not natural to her, and she freezes, and afterwards she can't believe she froze, and she has a lot of guilt, and that's her challenge. It's that courage she finds hard, and she's found it hard before to challenge Thomas, even though she had a daughter. And she has a lot of guilt over that too, because she knows her daughter was unhappy and wasn't really able to advocate for her. So that is her challenge. But again, I think it's something that a lot of us can sympathize with. I think we all like to think we are the hero, where there's something going on and we're going to do the right thing and save the day. But I think probably what is true for a lot of us is that we will have those moments of crisis and doubt and self-doubt, and be unable to act in the way that we had hoped. And so that's part of Fola's journey, is that she's had this experience where she froze, and that's going to impact her going forward in her future decisions.
I'm sure. That was a really tough scene. But you and I both, I think, are dealing with this theme of people coming from a certain culture that has given them a certain perspective, and a certain perspective on these other people over there. And when they go meet those other people over there, that initial impression, it can challenge what the beliefs that they come with. And so when you interact with actual people who you all is the stories that your own culture tells, and they're usually not flattering, and then you actually go meet them, and suddenly, oh wait, they're actually much more like me than I thought, and they're not so bad. And so you and I are both dealing with this idea of characters who are growing up in a somewhat parochial situation with ideas about the way the world is, and then forced out of that cocoon, forced out of that womb into a bigger world where suddenly, wait, the stories I was told are not actually completely accurate, are they? Right? And that's Fola. She's really, I think, in her interactions with Murka, especially, because that's the primary thing I think where this is going. I think she's finding the narrative to not really hold the narrative that Tomas had basically maybe he believes it too. So I don't know if I would call it brainwashed her, but certainly he, you know, has given her this narrative that doesn't quite hold up when she actually meets these people, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so Mirka he's a real historical character. He's a son of Brian Brew.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he's obviously a key character in the story. And so she kind of comes into his life thinking he's like this brutal warrior and horrible person and killer. And actually, when she starts to speak to him, you find out that that's actually not what he's about. And actually, King Brian, as well as Mirka, have lived in a province that was invaded heavily by the Vikings, and actually what they're trying to do is to stop that happening again.
Yeah.
And trying to change sort of how Ireland operates. And it's not they're not looking power for power's sake. They're looking to make Ireland safer, which she knew nothing about. So yeah, so she's getting a lot of her preconceived ideas are being challenged by actual interactions with the people.
Yeah. Not least Mirka's reaction or lack of reaction to the scarring on her. It doesn't seem to matter to him. He's interested in her as a person, as a friend.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that surprises her a lot, right? That he would treat her kindly, actually. And she's initially, they don't exactly, a lot gets lost in translation initially. They don't exactly get off to on a good start, do they? In terms of because she has this preconceived idea about him to begin with. And so she's a bit standoffish with him. And then he has to kind of show her, I guess, that he's sincere. So that's a really great relationship that you've got going there. I think it's fascinating. And her decision to save him is very much related to the decision earlier, which I'm sure she feels terrible about, Lonan, not saving him. And so she's in this position again where, oh no, I'm not supposed to do this, but if I don't heal him, here are the consequences. And so she thinks for herself, or she feels
she thinks that time.
Yeah. She goes through with it that time. So that's a great moment in there. So yeah, I love the way you dealt with that theme, and I expect it to continue in the next book as well, which is, by the way, is out, isn't it? Your second book is
it's out on NetGalley. So if you're a blogger, you can request it now, but it's not out until September / October
September time. Oh, good grief. Okay, we have to wait till September. Oh no. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll have to be patient then.
But I'm very excited. There's one more POV character in book 2.
So you're adding a third POV character.
Yeah, they only have 3 chapters, so they're not. It's not like the 3 people are interweaving. It's still very much Gormla and Fola, but there's one other character that has 3 chapters throughout the story.
Oh, cool. Okay, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, I actually increased the number of POVs with each book myself.
Because you have quite a few.
I do.
So why Day Ravens? Sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead. I'll go after you.
Yeah, no, I was saying obviously Day Raven is number 1 POV.
Yeah.
But you also have chapters from, I'm going to say her name wrong. Is it Sakura or
close? Yeah. A lot of people are saying Sakara, but I pronounce it Saquara. But yeah.
Saquara. Yeah. So I loved her POV chapters. But you also every so often have a POV moment from someone that hasn't had moments before.
Yes.
So which I really liked as well, because it's like an element of surprise. Like you can very random, suddenly see someone else's perspective, which is always interesting. And that really worked at the battle at the end.
Yes.
Where you're kind of moving through different characters' perspectives, which I really enjoyed. Yeah,
I wrote that battle before reading Joe Abercrombie, and realized when I read Abercrombie, oh my God, he did what I was trying to do, and he did it so well, with the head hopping in the middle of the battle, that sort of thing. So But I like how that came out, and Sequara has almost as many POV chapters as Dayraven. She has much more at the end, though. She has a couple in the beginning, and then there are big gaps without her. But then toward the end, she's every other chapter. So yeah, she's definitely a very important character for me. And of course, there's the priests and Dayraven's friends, and there'll be more POVs in book 2, and even more, and some brand new characters in books 2 and 3. So yeah. But yeah,
okay, that's good. I like it when the worlds expand, and it's
that
definitely
seems to be the way it goes. Yeah, they go expanding. Yeah. So why did you decide 2 POVs? Was that a conscious thing you thought about, or it just was instinct and that's what you did? And I know why you chose these 2 women, but you could talk about that maybe a little bit more too.
It was just very instinctive, and obviously Gormla is a historical character.
Yeah.
But I have also made her a Fomorian, so she has fire magic.
Yeah.
And in the old mythologies, the Fomorians and the Tuatha Danaan were enemies. So it just made sense that you had one Fomorian and one Tuatha Danaan as your 2 POVs. And then I already knew Gormla's character because I'd read all those historical accounts, and she's classed as a bit of a warmonger and is engaged to multiple people at the same time. So she's not written of in very nice terms.
I mean,
so
historically, there's a very important battle that happens later that she's said to be very pivotal and instigating. That's one of the main things we know about her. So
that's and at that stage, she's doing lots of crazy things to try and win support for Citric, her son. So I knew I was going to do her as that character, and then I knew I needed a character that was going to be very different. Otherwise, I don't think it'd be entertaining to have 2 Gormlas any more than it would be entertaining to have 2 Folas. You need the yin and the yang you need that contrast there. So the characters came to me really quickly. I didn't have to think about that too much, actually. So, and then once I had the timeline written out, the stories ended up weaving together really well once I got going.
Oh, cool. That's really neat. Yeah, I love hearing how the stories evolve that way. And sometimes the characters just tell you what to do, it's kind of neat.
Gormla's very bossy. Like, she does not let you let her do things that she is like, there's no way I would say that. She's very fun to write for because she has such a distinct voice. So she's lots of fun. But then Fola as well, she's distinct too. Like, I find them both quite easy to write. I'd never have to kind of be, I need to put my Gormla hat on now, or Fola. They are just there in my head.
So do you have a favorite between them, or is that impossible? It's like asking, do you have a favorite child, right? You can't say.
Yeah, it's impossible. Yeah. Because they're both, well, Fola obviously is a much nicer person, so she's much more lovable, but Gormla is she's very funny to write. Like, she says, I'm writing things that she says, and I'm shocked by the stuff that she says that kind of she comes up with, which is fun. She's trying to break down barriers, so we have to try and support her.
Well, she's a vivid character. She's a vivid and compelling character, and that's what you're after as an author. But Fola is also compelling in her own way too, with her crisis of, do I stick with what I know, what I've been raised to believe, or do I start allowing the evidence that I'm coming across to change my beliefs? And that can be a real crisis for a lot of people too, right? So.
Yes, it definitely. That I think more of us have Fola in us than Gormla. But in saying that, I've been obviously doing a lot of editing of book 2 because it's now off to the printers. And Fola's story in book 2, now that these preconceived notions have fallen away, her book 2 arc is amazing. I really, really love it.
Oh, wow.
Um,
It's exciting. Yeah.
yeah. So she has a bigger journey and development maybe than Gormla.
Uh-huh.
But it's really enjoyable
Yeah, because
to
of
write for her.
course, and anybody who wanted to spoil themselves could find out the actual history, I suppose. Although you're free
Yeah,
to diverge from that if you wanted to, I'm sure. But so with Gormla, her story is kind of sort of written in a way. But
yeah,
with Fola, you're writing her story, and so you have a little more freedom, I guess, in a way with her, don't you?
yeah. Yes, I do. So that's nice as well. You can be more creative and yeah, which is always interesting to just, you know, you have that blank page in front of you in the next chapter, and it's, oh, what, you know, what is Fola up to? What is she going to do? How is she feeling? And it's completely in my head.
Yeah.
Whereas you're right, Gormla has a historical timeline, and in fact, her story, especially as we move into book 2 and 3, starts to become quite heavily documented.
Mm-hmm.
So there's much more that I need to follow,
Interesting. Okay.
which is maybe a bit more constricting. But also, you know, she's up to no good in all the historical accounts, so it's fine.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Oh, I love to hear it. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to continuing in the story. I think you've got a couple of really compelling characters, even your secondary characters as well, the non-POVs. I find a lot of them to be really interesting characters, and I want to know what happens with them. I mean, I do know what happens to some of them, unfortunately, because I've read enough history. So I kind of know what's coming in some cases. And I'm a little bit, I have to say, dreading it because you've made me attached to these characters. So
I know. But it is, well, all mythologies are tragedies, really.
yeah.
So yeah. So, you know, be prepared to be emotional.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
books 2 and 3. But hopefully also entertained. And you know, there's lots of battles going on in books 2 and 3 that are hopefully going to be enjoyable to read.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I saw the Twitter thing about Mark Lawrence mentioned an author who was trying to make the battles or the fight scene better, and it turned out to be you. That was great. And
I know. So my first drafts, I call vomit drafts. So if there's a scene that I'm just not into writing, I will just leave a note for myself and be like, make this fight scene better, and then I'll just move on. So I'm now editing book 3 and I'm finding all these notes and I'm like, oh, Shauna, why don't you just write the scenes when you're doing them? Because yeah, you know, it's difficult to write good battle scenes, you all know, because you know, if you don't find an interesting way to convey a battle, it can be boring. You know, just like people hitting each other with swords. You don't want to do that. Yeah, so you do, a battle scene's actually quite hard to do well.
It is,
and to kind of bring the emotion into the scene.
Yeah, what I found is that if you go on too long with people hitting each other with swords, it's actually kind of boring. It's counterintuitive. You would think that would be exciting because there's all this swashbuckling going on, but actually the tension beforehand and the consequences afterwards, I think, are much more interesting than the actual hacking and that sort of thing. You know, there's a certain amount that's good, and everybody's taste will vary. Some people like to be thrown into a battle for a bit, but you know, others are not going to. And I went kind of, in my case, I went a little bit graphic during the battle scenes. I wanted the violence to be painful. I wanted it to be scary. I wanted it to be visceral. So I go into more detail probably than a lot of writers would in some of those scenes. But it's tricky. I agree, because you're gonna have some people who want more blood and guts, and others who want everything to be a little cleaner. And you know, so I think you just have to go with what you feel is right, what is compelling, and you know, hopefully.
Yeah, but don't worry. I did fix the battle. I made the battle interesting.
Good.
Yeah,
I'm sure
I fixed it up. Yeah. I listened. I did listen to my notes. But yeah, what you see, because what you did with your battle scene is because you had lots of different POV characters interweaving.
Yeah.
So you're getting lots of different emotional hits throughout the sequence.
Yeah.
which is very good. And obviously Joe Abercrombie does that in his books as well, and that's why those scenes are so good with him as well. But obviously for my book one, I didn't have that luxury because I just had the two.
You have two
characters.
POVs. Yeah.
But in books 2 and 3, there's more POVs, so that will hopefully change as well.
Okay, cool. Now, I mean, you succeeded in making me feel scared, though. I mean, with the POV that you had when I was with Fola, you know, watching this unravel, I knew who the other characters were. Like, I felt bad for Harold. I like Harold. You know, he was nice. You know, he was, for a big brute, you know, he was actually much smarter than anyone credited him for, and a decent fella in many ways. But kind of a victim of his own, I guess, or his own culture's heroic ideal, perhaps. But I was a little sad for Harold.
He challenged it a little bit too, because he was sort of quite content with his lot, and he liked his wife and his daughters and didn't really want to be king. So I really wanted you to like Harold, and then I really wanted you to like Lunan and Mirka, and they're obviously in this battle sequence, and you know, some of them are going to die, and I wanted you to like everybody. Well,
you succeeded in that for sure. Beautifully. So, well, this has been a lot of fun. Do you have any other questions for me, or anything that you want to touch on in terms of writing? I think, by the way, it's cool that Mark Lawrence is obviously a fan of your book as well. And I was so fortunate to have him read The Way of Edan, and what a great guy he is to support authors the way he does.
He does so much. Obviously he runs the self-publishing blog off, which is massive in the indie community. It filled up in 41 minutes.
41 minutes. I'm one of the judges this year, so I'm
I heard that, and that's amazing. But he reads a lot of other authors' books, and so he blurbed my book, which was really lovely, because he didn't have to. And so he's a great person to talk about writing with, and he's very interesting as well. He writes very differently to me. His first drafts are very clean. So my first drafts are horrible.
I don't know how he does that. I honestly have no clue how he does that. I mean, that's, to me, is like, I mean, I because he does a lot with chronology that I feel would require some planning, but he just does it. I guess it just comes out of him that way, and which is great. You know, I think that's amazing.
He's very smart. You can tell that when you're speaking to him. He's very, very clever.
Yes.
I'm not, and I just think I have to get through my story in draft form to make sure everything ties together before I kind of commit. Whereas he just is pure imagination. Let's just go and see what happens.
Although he did say that the book that wouldn't burn is one where he had to go back and do the most revising ever. So, and I was like, I can see why too, because it's so intricate in some ways what he's doing in that. So, I love that book too, by the way. And you reviewed that.
I've read it as well. It's fantastic. Really, really good. Very, very, very intriguing and interesting and beautiful. Like, it's prose in Broken Empire is really some of the best prose I've read in fantasy. Like there'd just be some killer lines.
Oh, he's so quotable. His books are so quotable.
So it's the same for the book that wouldn't burn. There's lots of lines where you'll go, oh yeah.
So when you're writing, do you ever write a line and think to yourself, oh, I hope somebody quotes that, you know? I think I nailed this sentence. I really hope somebody quotes it, right? Do you ever do that?
Oh, well, I haven't thought that, but I think sometimes I laugh. As I said, Gormla tells me what she wants. It makes me sound very odd, but I'm writing Gormla and she does these crazy things, and sometimes it makes me laugh, the things that she says.
Okay.
So some of my beta readers are reading book 3, and so I like it when they're like laughing at some of these things that I've laughed at when I'm writing. So hopefully.
Oh, how much fun. Well, it's a lot of fun to write, and we are obviously you have to be, I think, a little bit crazy to write. So it's okay if Gormla talks to you.
Yeah, she does.
Yep. You have to be just a little bit crazy to do this sort of thing, I think. You have to be passionate about it, because it is not something, let's just put it this way, it might be the dumbest way to try to get rich, to write books is probably,
Absolutely.
not the quickest path to wealth, right? So we do it out of passion, out of love for the story, and and it's wonderful to me to be able to chat with people like you about their stories and to hear back from you, your thoughts on my story. It's a lot of fun. So I really want to thank you, Shauna, for spending this time with me. I have enjoyed myself thoroughly. And I will recommend to everybody to check out The Children of Gods and Fighting Men. It is a brilliant, this is your debut, right?
Well, it's the first book I got published.
Okay.
I did write a book before that was unsuccessful. So I think actually that was good. It was good for me to have written that first book.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
I knew, even when I didn't find an agent or a publisher, I knew there was things wrong with it.
Yeah.
Structurally that just didn't quite work. So whenever I wrote The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, I really felt it all clicked together, and it was because of the learning experience from the previous book.
That's brilliant.
So that this is my first published book.
Which is a lesson, I think, for any of you out there who are thinking about writing. You're not going to write a brilliant book on your first attempt. You're going to write a very flawed book. And so, you just be willing to accept that, I think, is important, isn't it? To be able to write with accepting the fact that your first attempt is not going to be as brilliant as you hope, probably, but to be persistent and keep at it. And obviously you did that. So you took that learning experience and it helped you to make a beautiful story. So congratulations.
Yeah. I think that is really important for writers out there. And like, I know you love reading and writing, and you'll have been doing it for years and years, and that's the same as me. And persistence and consistency does pay off.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then the other thing is, I think, see, if you say to someone, oh, I've written a book, people quite often say to me anyway, like, oh, you're going to be the next J.K. Rowling, or, their expectations are already quite high. Whereas if you were to say to someone, oh yeah, I've started to play tennis, no one is going to say to you, oh, so when am I going to see you play at Wimbledon? Right? No one would say that, because that's crazy, right? So I think sometimes self-expectations can be too high with writing.
Yeah.
And you need to be, it's a slow art form, and you need to be kind to yourself. You need to be patient. It's something that you get better at with practice, I find. And so, there isn't, we live in a time where everyone rushes to do things and wants to do things right away. And it's fine to not do that with writing.
You have to
take your time.
Yeah.
Take your time. Get people to read your book before you hit that publish button, or you start to send off to agents.
Lots of people, hopefully people who are critical too, not just nice, right? Yeah.
That's so important. Like I used a site called Critique Circle for years.
Good for you.
Because I didn't know anyone in real life that would have read my work for me. And that was really, really good. Sometimes you need to have a bit of a thick skin, because people can critique your work, but ultimately it is better to have someone critique your work on a learning platform like that, kind of to publish something and then suddenly have a deluge of like bad Goodread reviews, if you know what I mean.
I do.
And it helps you improve. It's good for you as well. It's good to improve, and you also on those sites have to read other people's work. To kind of get that to get people to read for you. And that also helps, because I think when you read works of a high quality, writing can seem very easy. And actually sometimes it's when you read things that are bad or by a beginner writer, you go, ooh, I don't like that. And actually now I've seen them do it, I have just realized that I did that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So you become part of a community as a writer, hopefully, because it's so important to have those other eyes on your story. I will say, though, that I have fantasized about playing Wimbledon myself. So
Oh, right. Okay.
I would never make it there, but I have fantasized about it. So,
Okay, well, you never know. You need to start practicing.
well, I might be a little old for that now. Most tennis players are retired by the time they're in their 30s, and I'm already over 50. So, yeah, I think it's
Well, if
helpful.
you're having a dream, you may as well have a decent dream.
Yeah,
If
dream
it was,
big, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
why not?
So, well, maybe I'll visit Wimbledon someday and watch them play. So, yeah, that'll have to do.
Yeah, that's a good second dream to have. That's maybe a bit more
Yeah, a little
attainable.
more realistic. A little more realistic.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I can keep writing and enjoying myself. And I
Mhm.
wish you much joy and fulfillment in your writing. I think you're off to a wonderful start here. And I can't wait to read book 2. What's the title for book 2?
Book 2 is The Words of Kings and Prophets.
Brilliant. The Words of Kings and Prophets. I love it. So we both have the word prophet in our book 2, by the way.
We do.
Mine is the Prophet of Edan. So
yeah, you see, I know, I definitely was reading yours, and I said I could see the Celtic influences. And I saw your cover reveal on YouTube a few days ago, and so I saw your title, and I was like, oh, there's more similarities.
Yep. Yeah. Well, great minds think alike, right? Right.
That's it. Yeah.
That's it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Shauna. I will let you go now. And thank you for this wonderful conversation. And thank you, everybody who has been watching this. And as I said, go and check out The Children of Gods and Fighting Men. It is a great read. I had a wonderful time with it. I found myself so invested in the characters. I loved how vivid your characters are. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And
thank you so much. And thank you for your book as well, which I really, really enjoyed so much. I'm actually disappointed that you're a judge on SBFBO, because I thought you were going to enter your book into the competition. I think it would have done very well.
It was a tough choice, but I ultimately decided that it would be very fulfilling for me to be a judge, and I want to support self-published fantasy, and I love what Mark Lawrence has done with this. I want to do my little bit to help out. So to me, that ultimately was more important than throwing my hat in the ring, I suppose. But you know, it is what it is. But I'm happy with the decision. I'm really happy. I'm excited to read these stories too. So yeah.
I have a few friends who've entered their books, so it's going to be a very fun year for me to watch them, hoping my friends are going to do very well. But there's lots of other entrants that I've seen that sound amazing. So I think it's going to be very stiff competition this year.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah, it would be lots of fun.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Shauna. Thank you once again, everybody. And until next time.